Welcome to the Managing Violence Podcast, helping to make communities safer by providing education in how to prevent, prepare, respond, and recover from violence in all its forms. Your host is an expert in violence and aggression management. Here is Joe Saunders.
This episode is brought to you by R2S Academy. If you're after premium e-learning courses in topics such as occupational violence prevention, security and safety awareness, behavioural observation and suspicious activity recognition, active armed offender management, fire safety and evacuation, stressful situation response, resilience building, and, so many more. Check out the full range of pre-built courses at www.r2s.academy. But that's not all. R2S Academy are learning design specialists and have built tailored risk, security, and emergency courses for companies and government entities in Australia and around the world. For more information, check out www.r2s.academy. And if you'd like 10% off your purchase, enter the coupon code JOEMVP. That's JOEMVP. Check it out now. www.r2s.academy. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Managing Violence Podcast. I am your host, Joe Saunders. We are getting towards the business end of Season 3. Here we are with Episode 9 of Season 3, and it is a big one. It is one of my favorite guests of the season thus far, and we've had some great guests. I won't lie, it's been a very star-studded season, which is saying something compared to Season 2, which we were also quite star-studded. But Season 3, Episode 9 is going to be with the co-author of one of my favorite books on violence, Left of Bang. I am, of course, talking about Mr. Patrick Van Horne. Patrick is a veteran of the United States Marine Corps and was one of the instructors of the Combat Hunter program, which is a behavioural profiling program that was designed, I won't give you the full story, but it was designed to basically help Marines identify insurgents and those with evil intent prior to bad things happening, or bang, whether it be an attack, an ambush, or an IED, or whatever the case was. But it was basically a behavioural profiling course to help identify the early indicators of a violent attack. Now, once Patrick got out of the Marine Corps, he wanted to take these skills and to basically share them with people in all different areas, whether it be law enforcement, security professionals, or indeed even just regular people that are looking out for one another and applying these rules and these principles even to the boardroom. So it's a really fascinating read. I highly recommend you checking out Left of Bang. It's available in all the places you would normally get your books, and also available on Audible. So if you're an audiobook fanatic like I am, check it out over there as well. I really need to get Audible to start sponsoring the show because I listen to a lot of Audible. And it'd be really nice if I didn't have to pay for it. Anyway, moving on. So Patrick Van Horne was very gracious with his time. He dumped a ton of information in this episode, and I really hope you enjoy it. But before we get into the episode, I just want to remind you that our Patreon is patreon.com/managing violence. And as I mentioned last week or last episode, every cent that comes through Patreon during the Australian fire season, which basically runs from, now until whenever the fires stop, which will probably be around March-ish, we think. But every cent that comes in during the fire season will be donated to bushfire charities to help the country get back on its feet. It's going to be a long journey, but I'll help in whatever way I can, in whatever meager means that is. So if you would like to contribute to the show, and you'd also like to contribute to Australia's efforts to get back on our feet after the devastating bushfires, then head over to www.patreon.com/managing violence, or of course donate at any one of the other charities that are out there. All right, without further ado, here is Mr. Patrick Van Horne. Thanks for joining us, Patrick. It's fantastic to have you on the show. I've been a fan of your work and an avid recommender and reviewer of your book for a couple of years, so it's great to talk to you.
Oh, I really appreciate that. I was really honored when you reached out to ask, and so I look forward to talking today.
Brilliant. So, Patrick, Left of Bang is your book, but I know your career didn't start as an author. So, if you could just take some time to talk to our audience about what your background is and the origins of the material that would become Left of Bang.
Absolutely. And so the book Left of Bang is written about the Marine Corps Combat Hunter course. It was a course that was created in 2007 to teach Marines how do you recognize threats proactively. At that point, during the Marine and Army times in Iraq and Afghanistan, we'd become very reactive to threats. We, as the enemy and our adversaries had taken off their uniforms and blended back in with everyone else from the villages and the cities we were patrolling, we'd lost our ability to identify who out there was hunting us. And so this course was designed to give Marines that ability. And towards the end of my time in the Marines, I was lucky enough to get brought into the program. I had joined the Marines just a little bit after September 11th, going to college just north of New York City. And so I made the decision that I wanted to go in and serve. And then I was lucky enough for my path to bring me into the Combat Hunter program after I had already deployed a couple of times. So I had both the operational experience, and then I was able to bring it into how are we training and preparing Marines to go overseas and not only stay safe, but really to help them accomplish the missions that they were being assigned.
Yeah, great. So if you can just talk a little bit about, so the Combat Hunter was an evolution. What did it look like before that? So prior to Combat Hunter, what sort of training was being provided in terms of recognizing threats?
Not a lot. There were some units and some kind of special units who maybe had some advanced training, but a lot of what the Marines were focused on was reaction to things. It was react to an ambush, react to a sniper, react to the improvised explosive devices, the IEDs, the roadside bombs that we were dealing with. A lot of what we were focused on almost had this underlying assumption that you can't prevent these attacks from occurring, so we need to be ready to react to them in the best, most efficient, most effective way possible. The problem with that was that, unfortunately, a lot of Marines and soldiers were getting wounded and getting killed. And it was only in 2007 when then Marine General James Mattis, who went on to ultimately become the Secretary of Defense, looked at the situation and said it was unacceptable, that we have to give Marines the ability to recognize threats proactively. And it was really a course that was designed to fill this hole and this gap and how we were preparing to go overseas.
Yeah, I really like that focus on shifting away from being reactive, and it's something that I talk about a lot. My area of expertise, I guess the area I consult on most is occupational violence and workplace violence, and a lot of what's offered in that market is purely reactive. It's training people to deal with aggression, it's training people to respond to aggression, but there's very little work that's actually put in place to identify early signs of aggression and build positive rapport and all those sorts of other soft skills that will enable someone to not be in that situation in the first place. And I think it's just, there's a parallel across so many different industries where we focus so much on bouncing back, and it just sort of this passive acceptance that bad things are going to happen and we just have to be able to deal with them, as opposed to looking at it objectively and saying, what can we do to prevent these bad things from happening so we don't have to take those casualties in the first place.
And that's really, it's really an interesting kind of perspective on this. And it's something we have found too. And it's not negative. It's the reason why a lot of these organizations haven't had a proactive focus in the past was there really wasn't something there for them to learn. There really wasn't something for them to build off of. It was either on protection of how can we stop attacks from occurring kind of through defensive or deterrent methods, and how can we look like a harder target so that people don't want to attack us. But that's different than being very deliberately proactive. And it took, what the Marines had created they were forced into a situation where just based on the number of Marines getting hurt and killed, we have to find a better way. And they were able to bring together the right experts, the right team to really design a process and behaviors so that you can take someone who may not have that life experience to be able to do this intuitively or naturally, and just start that education to teach them how do you very deliberately assess human behavior so that you can identify people who might have a violent intent, so that your attention can go from looking at a crowd as a whole and looking at 100 people and going, 98 of these people don't matter to me right now, but these two people, they are doing something that's different than everyone else, and therefore I'm going to focus on them. And it doesn't always mean they're definitely a threat. It just means I'm going to focus on these two people until I can identify what their intentions are. And if it turns out that their intent is violent, I'm already going through that process of thinking about what I'm going to do, and I'm already starting to take action so that at least we have the upper hand in those situations.
Yeah, can you speak a little bit about the development of the program? I guess the trial and error, or the process you went to, or the Marine Corps went through when developing the program, and then moving on to writing the book for a broader audience.
It was kind of, I wasn't involved in the creation of the program. It was originally led by a former police officer from Detroit who brought in a lot of his street experience, and their course and the behaviors that we were teaching were ultimately backed by a number of different science review boards to make sure that the behaviors in the process that we're going through were structured and backed in peer-reviewed science, so that everything could be articulated in an objective way. But what led to Jason Riley, my co-author, and I writing the book was the two of us were instructors in that program, and we came into the program as it was maturing, as it was evolving, but we started to see this one really big gap. We were training, give or take, about 40 out of every 1,000 Marines who deployed. And we had some pretty strict instructor to student ratio that we couldn't really deviate from. So we were really limited at 40 students from every battalion that was deploying. And we had Marine units who were deploying, coming back, and we would see some of the Marines we had trained coming back saying, hey, there was something I learned in this course that saved my life. There was something here that, I'm alive today because of it. I want to come back through the course again. Unfortunately, because we could only train 40, we had to tell them, we're sorry. One, we're very happy that things worked out for you, but we have to get to a different group of Marines to continue to spread the skill set. And it was just because of how new the program was, there was nothing for that Marine to turn to start to develop themselves, to start to practice. And Jason and I just looked at each other one day and said, we've got to get this out there in a way that's easily consumable, that's available to anyone who wants to learn these skills. And ultimately, that's what led to us writing the book and trying to just create awareness for the left of bang concept, as well as the behaviors that the Marines were learning, so that hopefully we could hit a larger and larger percentage of people who are going into harm's way.
Great. And for those that may not be familiar with the terminology, can you just explain what left of bang actually means?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way I kind of often describe it is, if you were to think about whatever event you don't want to occur in your life, we're talking about violence here, but it could be a drug deal, it could be sexual harassment, it could be some sort of domestic violence, it could be your kids getting bullied. It's simply whatever thing you don't want to occur in your life, that is bang. When you take bang and you put it onto a timeline, it's time zero. It's directly in the middle of that line. When we talk about getting left of bang, it means that you as an observer have the ability to recognize those pre-event indicators, those warning signs that exist that let you know, hey, bang is about to occur, and to give you enough time to do something about it. It's where we can be proactive. Being right of bang means that you had no advance warning whatsoever. Bang occurred, and that was the first time you realized that something was going on. And so because you had no advance warning, because you missed all of those warning signs, you're now completely reactive to whatever is happening.
Yeah, it's a really useful concept. I use it a lot when I'm just trying to articulate where different skill sets and different responses fit within a continuum. Because there is a time and place for right of bang. There's going to be a time when something happens and you will, for whatever reason, possibly not even your fault, you're completely unprepared, completely taken by surprise, and you need to have skills to be able to manage the chaos and bring it back into a controllable situation. But I think there's so much that can be done left of bang to either prevent or at least be ready for when those situations do occur. So let's change gears. I think that's a really good introduction to the history of the program and what it is. Let's talk about some lessons that people can take away. So I know this book has been really well received. You've had quite a few quite a few interviews that I've tracked down while I was preparing for this one, and I know it's required reading for a number of agencies now. So, what are the number one things what are the common things that people are taking away and saying that was really useful?
I guess I would hope that at least that there were kind of three different answers to that question, and the first is knowing what you are looking for and what makes someone a threat in the first place. And especially as we use the left of bang concept and apply it to safety and threat recognition. The first is, when oftentimes we'll ask people what makes someone a threat, they'll often talk about, you might be looking for someone with a weapon or someone who has the ability to kill you. But when you think about what a threat is, it's someone who has both the intention and the ability to kill you. Now, in the world that we live in, where right here I'm in Denver, Colorado, there was a stabbing this morning where 8 people were killed just south, or at least I don't know if they were killed. 8 people were stabbed a little bit south of Denver by someone today. And so it's not necessarily the ability to hurt someone that we care about, because anyone could do that. But if you're going to get left of bang, it means that you have to have the ability to identify the people who have a violent intent. And if you can identify people who have a violent intent, the chances of you becoming or getting left of bang go up exponentially, because that is ultimately what you're searching for. And so I hope that's one of the pieces that they take away. The second is, well, how do you do that? The way that we teach and the way the Marine Corps had developed the Combat Hunter program was to teach this really simple formula. First, you establish a baseline. You identify what is normal for the area that I'm in, what is normal for the people who are here. And once you know it's normal, you begin hunting for the anomaly, the thing that is not here, or the thing that is not normal. And when you think about what that means with violent intent, if you're in a restaurant and you think of all the legitimate reasons why someone could be in this restaurant, the behaviors that allow someone to be in that restaurant for their legitimate intent, that's where the baseline comes from. It's the people who are in this area with a violent intent is what will lead their behavior to be a little bit different than everyone else's. And so the formula that we teach is really simple. It's baseline plus anomaly equals decision. Figure out what's normal, search for those things that are not normal. And the moment you see the thing that's not normal, you have to make a decision. We're not trying to recognize threats just for the sake of recognizing threats. We're doing it to take action. And so by, the better we can go through this process. And then the third piece, to answer that really quickly, is just the way that you establish a baseline can come from these universal elements of human nonverbal behavior that are uncontrollable, to give us the ability to both accurately assess, what a person's intentions are, and the ability to do it very, very quickly. You walk into a room of, a few hundred people, you can't look at every gesture, posture, expression, but you can start to identify these clusters of behaviors that we talk about in the book that allow you to really quickly assess what someone's intentions are, so that you can say, yep, they're part of the baseline. I don't have to worry about them. Or no, these behaviors are a little bit different from the baseline. I need to figure out what's going on with this person. And so knowing that we're looking for people with violent intent, we're going to use a baseline plus anomaly equals decision structure. And we're going to use these universal and uncontrollable elements of nonverbal behavior to establish that baseline. I guess is how it answer that very simple question that you had. It's a very long-winded answer about what we hope people take away from the book.
Yeah, that's great. I'd really be interested in unpacking that, because if we talk about terrorist events for the moment, in this modern age of what I like to call crowdsourced terrorism, where we have lone actors, or at least what appears to be lone actors, although we usually find out later they're a part of a network that they weren't purely a lone actor. But what's often said in the media is that it was completely out of the blue. No one saw it coming. It was a regular person. And I think the general population has sort of accepted this narrative that you'll never be able to see it coming. It's just going to happen. And yet when we go back, we are able to look at CCTV or witness accounts of the individual prior to the attack. Any of us with trained eyes can see the issue arriving. We can see the body language. We can see it. So I think there's a missing piece there in terms of, one, just the acceptance that, yes, we can predict it. Two, that the actor is human and is going to exhibit human traits of stress and duress and all those other elements that we can pick up on. Can you speak to a little bit about those universal human behavior elements that people may not be aware of that they should be aware of?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And, there are going to be some attacks that are unpreventable. So when and we'll talk about these behaviors, but if the behaviors, just to kind of go back, are a result of what a person's intent is. And so if a person decides to commit violence and in the split second from making that decision enacts their plan, right, there just simply isn't any time available to realize what they were intending to do and stop it. So there are going to be some situations you can't prevent, but the reality is a lot of the situations we've seen, at least here in America, and a lot of the attacks we've seen around the world, they weren't completely unplanned. They weren't completely spontaneous. There was some sort of thought and preparation that went into it. And so by knowing that, we can start to realize there is a time available to us. There is some sort of opportunity to recognize these people. But we just have to know kind of very specifically what we are looking for. The behaviors that we go into, in the book, we refer to them as the 6 domains of behavior. We teach it a little bit differently now, kind of refer to them as the 4 pillars of behavior, but there are ways that we can assess individual people, which is the first pillar of behavior. There's ways that we can assess groups of people, which is the second pillar. The third pillar is how we assess the environment. And the fourth is how we assess the collective mood. So if we were to look at just this first pillar of behavior, every single person at every moment in time can be categorized in one of 4 ways. Their behavior shows that they are either dominant, submissive, uncomfortable, or comfortable. Every person at every moment in time is in one of these 4 classifications. And so when we think about how do we assess someone who's dominant, what we're actually looking for are people who are exhibiting the behaviors and the body language of a person whose fight response to stresses and threats has been triggered. And so you might see people, if you were just even think about someone preparing to get in a fight in a bar, as they start to use their body to take up more space, as they start to make aggressive and dominant displays of behavior, even at a low intensity, that's showing us that the fight response has been triggered. And a lot of the attacks that we see, a person almost always shifts into the dominant cluster behavior at some point before launching their attack. And while there are always legitimate reasons why someone is displaying that behavior, when you recognize, let's say, dominance at a very high intensity, you have an idea that this person's preparing for some sort of confrontation. You can go from looking at this crowd of comfortable people, you see this one person who's dominant. Even if we have a few seconds or even a few minutes before it occurs, they're starting to give off signs that they are preparing for some sort of fight. They're preparing to be, aggressive and confrontational.
Yeah, that's great. Let's build upon that a little bit when we're talking about groups and crowds and so on. So, like as I mentioned to you offline, a large percentage of our audience work in either law enforcement or some sort of protection or security role, and oftentimes we are tasked with supervising a group that where 99% of the group will be peaceful, but there's always the potential that we're going to have a couple of people with bad intent, and at the moment here in Australia, I'm sure you're aware, we've got massive issues with bushfires, and that's been compounded now. We've got a lot of protest activity happening with climate change protesters and so on, which as tensions rise and as the general public are more frustrated and angry and scared and emotional about everything that's happening, there's a potential for the protest to no longer be peaceful, and there's always that you'll have a handful of people that want to make a statement in a more deliberate or aggressive manner. So when you're training groups, what do you teach them to look for when it comes to identifying people within a crowd?
So as I mentioned, there's 4 ways that we can assess an individual person: dominant, submissive, uncomfortable, and comfortable. And so what I would be looking for, without having seen any videos of your protester, having any specific information on that, would, people might be displaying a low intensity of dominance, right? They're angry, they're there to protest, they're there to make their statement. And so they're naturally displaying a certain level of aggressiveness and a certain level of dominance. But what you're looking for is anyone whose dominance is higher than everyone else's, who is more angry, who is more aggressive, who is more dominant in the situation. And by identifying those people, you can create an opportunity to de-escalate the situation. And sometimes, especially in the law enforcement world, de-escalation, that topic, it comes with a lot of baggage right now. But all de-escalation is taking someone who's dominant, who that fight response has been triggered in their body, and finding a way to make them comfortable, where you're removing that stressor or that threat that is causing them to react the way they are. Sometimes that could be, being submissive. Hey, I am sorry. I know you're angry. I know all this stuff is going on, but here's the situation. Here's what we're dealing with. Sometimes that approach could work. Sometimes to get someone who's dominant and remove that dominance, take someone more aggressive. I'm going to be more dominant than you are and let you know that your behavior is irresponsible or unacceptable right now. And you get to choose which of these 4 clusters, dominant, submissive, uncomfortable, or comfortable, you think is going to be the one to help get them to start to calm down, to start to remove some of those stresses and threats that are causing them to be aggressive. And of course, you, especially in a protest setting, it's a challenge because it's not one answer is going to work for everyone. Whereas one person might require, seeing an authority figure who is being assertive to calm down and say, if you cross this line, you're going to go to jail or something bad's going to happen. While it might work for that one person, it could also provoke the other person to, do something a little bit more bold or a little bit more inciting. And so there's a challenge inside of protest scenarios. But the more often you can identify who is displaying dominance, or really it's any behavior other than the baseline, again, you can just start to identify, these 99% of the people, they are fine. They're doing what we expect. It's just these 1 or 2 people here that require some sort of attention, some sort of way for us to either remove them from the situation or get them to calm down so this whole group doesn't become violent.
Yeah, it's a really valid point, and I think, as you said, the protest environment does change things a little bit because you're dealing with a group of people that are united by cause and that believe they're in the right, or else they wouldn't be there.
Mm-hmm.
So any sort of overt aggression towards that group can actually escalate into motivating others that might have been on the fringe of action to stick in. But at the same time, sometimes you do have those very volatile leaders that are continually throwing more gasoline on the fire and sometimes taking them out early, and whether it's arresting them or separating them from the group or whatever it is, can lead to a more peaceful outcome in the long term. But it certainly is a challenge, and something that given our emergency responders resources are already thin, it's something I'm keeping a close eye on here, because I'm really not sure that they'll stay peaceful forever. But moving on from there, one of the things that I found interesting, it might be a little bit of a sidestep. You mentioned in the book that intuition is something that's trained and something that's learned, and that people from different backgrounds tend to be more intuitive than others. Do you want to just touch on that topic a little bit?
Yeah, and so one of the original instructors in the Combat Hunter program was a former Marine who had grown up in a really, really tough area of Los Angeles. He had seen a lot of violence prior to ever joining the Marines. And when he was overseas, he was much more capable of realizing that something was about to happen. He was very good at realizing there's an ambush. We're about to get hit. There's something going on. Hey guys, we got to get off the street now. And because he had this lifetime of experience of being in dangerous areas and surrounded by violence, he had learned just for the sake of survival, how to know when something bad was going to happen. The challenge was, and that's often the case with a lot of people who had a lot of experience, at least in the case of recognizing threats, they've oftentimes just seen a lot of it and are able to pick up on a lot of the very subtle, nuanced indicators that are present. The challenge that the Marine Corps' Combat Hunter program spent a lot of time looking at was, well, it's great if the person from who grew up in this area of Los Angeles can do it, but we need to take someone who's grew up on a farm in the middle of nowhere, who saw a very small number of people their entire life, and give them the same ability. And so the way that we did that was, as you break down what intuition is and how it occurs and how you develop it, it was teaching them these behaviors that we're talking about here, and then providing scenario after scenario after scenario to recreate as many of those same experiences that the person who had grown up surrounded by violence had, to give them the ability to go through a process of, if the hair on the back of your neck is not standing up, we're in a situation where the threat might not be imminent, but how do you go into some sort of deliberate process to just really systematically examine and look at all of the people around me to either confidently know, no, I am safe right now, or, hey, I've gone through this process and there's something about this individual that doesn't make sense to me, or I want to alert someone or let someone know or make a decision about, hey, let's go see what's going on, or why is this person so uncomfortable right now? And by having the behaviors, we could structure systematically what those experiences needed to be to, again, just kind of compress that lifetime of experience that other people had before joining the military. And we certainly don't believe that we are replacing intuition or replacing that lifetime of experience, but what we're really trying to do is shorten that learning curve so that a person doesn't have to spend 18 years in the military before they become effective, or as a police officer or someone who works in executive protection. But how do you provide this structure where they can develop themselves, often on their own time, to become very capable at realizing, yes, I'm safe, or, hey, there's someone here that we need to pay attention to before we go any further.
Are you a fan of the show and would like it to keep going? Head on over to www.patreon.com/managingviolence and become a contributor. All money raised on Patreon goes directly into improving the quality of the show.
Yeah, one of the things that I really was glad that you mentioned and spent some time on in the book was not just recognizing, but then choosing to act. I think sometimes we can dump a lot of information on people about how to recognize that something's wrong, but they still end up getting stuck in this OODA loop of just continually, I know something's wrong, but I don't know what to do about it, and I don't know how to make a decision about it. And I think that's such a critical component, because all the awareness in the world doesn't make you any more useful unless you actually do something. And I think that's sometimes the criticism that practitioners in this field have with academics, is that the academics can tell you what's wrong, but they actually have no practical experience on acting upon or making a decision when potentially the wrong decision could cause someone's lives or their livelihood if it's a career-based situation. So can you talk a little bit about how you go through that decision-making process and empowering people to make good decisions once they've recognized something's wrong?
Yeah, absolutely. And so what you bring up is a very key point of what went into the Combat Hunter course. And we wanted to make sure that we were empowering and training Marines to succeed. And that meant being able to make decisions very quickly. And the basis for that is something that we refer to as a heuristic. And a heuristic is just a horrible, horrible word for a strategy that you use to make decisions. And it's a strategy that has, what's that?
A rule of thumb.
Absolutely. And, for that heuristic to work, it has to work in situations where you have a limited amount of time and a limited amount of information available to you. And we acknowledge right off the bat, the system and process that we teach is not designed to make perfect decisions. There's nothing out there that will get you to making a perfect decision. And by accepting that, our standard is making a decision that is more often right than wrong. And by teaching this baseline plus anomaly equals decision structure, this heuristic allows us to get to the point of making a decision more quickly than we would otherwise. And then we're able to integrate with whatever training one of our clients has or whatever their processes are, where obviously a member of the military, their decisions are going to be a little bit different than a police officers, who are going to be a little bit different than someone working in private security. And so by understanding here's the decision tree that this particular professional deals with, how do we build this, the behaviors and the experiences to get them to that point of recognizing that anomaly faster and faster and faster, because the additional time that you have in your planning time, or left to bang maybe allows you to make a better decision, or a decision that you can execute very decisively and definitively and confidently to ultimately have that upper hand. And the timing of this interview is pretty, it works out. We just posted an article to our site this past week about a story of an Army major who had gone through a similar course as the Combat Hunter course. It wasn't a course that we had taught, but it was based on the Marine Corps Combat Hunter program. And he stopped an attack in Afghanistan aboard Bagram Airfield, which is a huge, massive base, by getting just enough information to realize that this person who was posing as a contractor on the base was in fact the terrorist who was building and planting IEDs across the base. And at the time, he didn't have perfect information, but he was confident and comfortable knowing that he had to do something about it, and ultimately interrupted what would have been a very destructive attack for coalition forces in Afghanistan. And so it's not the perfect decision. It's just being comfortable and confident to make a decision with limited time and limited information that's going to be more often right than wrong.
Yeah, I think you raise an excellent point there, and I think one of the tools that I use when I'm talking about this is getting people to consider what's the worst case scenario if you say something versus what's the worst case scenario if you don't say something. And I think that's largely, I mean, with the audiences that I'm dealing with, a large part of what I do is talking to the executive and the board level people and saying you need to create a culture that empowers people to make decisions. If you want them to be more security aware, or you want them to be more aware of potential criminal activity, but then they have negative consequences every time they bring something up that doesn't happen, then you're actually you're counterproductive. You're not actually going to increase that culture of see something, say something, or do something, because your culture there is actually inhibiting people from taking decisive action.
Yeah, and that's one of the things we kind of run into a lot since writing the book and then doing training kind of on the a little bit more in the private sector. There's questions about that decision of, well, what led you to make this decision? And when people cannot articulate that, when they cannot communicate, well, I saw, this behavior and it meant this, and this is why I led to the decision. Without that ability, people naturally just kind of question your decisions. But when you can articulate it, people go, oh, I don't necessarily agree with the decision, but I understand how you got there. Or they realize, they hear that articulation and say, great, I missed all of those things. Thank you for doing that. And so the first kind of response to that is the ability to articulate systematically using the same terminology that someone else is using is key to building confidence in other people to trust your judgment and to trust your decisions. The other piece that goes into that, and I just blanked out. What is the other piece that goes into that?
While you're thinking of that, you go ahead.
The other thing is, it doesn't always have to be threat related. Let's say you're a executive protection, or you're working in some sort of corporate security, and you have a baseline of people who are uncomfortable, and you see someone who is displaying signs from the uncomfortable cluster. So that behavior triggers, your assessment and decision-making process to say, this person's an anomaly. I need to do something about it. And that decision can always be sometimes just having that conversation. And even a security professional can realize this person could be uncomfortable because they're planning an attack, or they're uncomfortable because they don't know how to get around security to get through the airport. Or they don't exactly know where they're going, and they're uncomfortable because they're going to be running late for something. And recognizing that person who just stands out from the baseline can sometimes just address your customer service issues. Seeing that person who is responding emotionally to the situation, identifying that person and addressing their need can oftentimes not only help ensure security, but also help the business as well by just being a little bit more empathetic and being able to connect with and relate to the people that you are talking to ultimately reduce those false positives by addressing their need, leaving only those people with a violent intent left for you to focus your attention on.
Yeah, it's an interesting point that stress is stress, and someone who's stressed because they have hostile intention may look very similar to someone who's stressed because they're running late for their connection. And
Mhm.
I think I've almost 100% that every single time I've been running late for a flight, I've been checked for explosives. Like nearly every single time I'll be pulled
Yeah.
aside when I have the least number of seconds that I can possibly spare. I'll be pulled aside for a random explosives check. So I think it's
Yeah.
100% of the time.
Oh.
I mean, good for them, I guess, for being aware.
Yeah.
But maybe
They, it's always good to know what your own triggers are too, of like, oh, this makes me stressed. I better get there early. Otherwise I'm going to be thought of as a terrorist. So I better get there and calm down so I'm not flagged.
Yeah, it's always interesting to identify who gets chosen for the quote unquote random testing. So
Yes.
and I think that's something that you mentioned in the book is actually profiling, and how profiling sometimes gets a negative rap. But what we're talking about here is profiling behavior, not profiling ethnicity or culture. But I do think there is there's a broader conversation we have about there's political correctness, and then there's safety and security, and profiling exists for a reason.
Yes. And, as kind of the courses and the program has adapted and evolved over time, we very rarely even use that word anymore, just because oftentimes it's a red flag word, and they hear profiling and they assume that we're talking about race, or they assume we're talking about religion. And the reality is that our processes, it doesn't matter what color your skin is, it doesn't matter what your religion is, because that in and of itself doesn't make you a potential threat. People of every ethnicity and every religion have conducted attacks in the past, and so it's to use that is not not every political or religious extremist ultimately becomes a terrorist. And so having that mindset, that you can identify someone that way, it's not just politically incorrect, it's simply ineffective from an operational perspective of accomplishing your mission. And so the behaviors that go into this program, it doesn't matter where you're from or what your preferences are. It's based on how is your behavior and your body language revealing your intentions, so that you can just continually hone in on those people who have that violent intent.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's there's a conversation that took place after the New Zealand massacre last year, where
Mm-hmm.
the perpetrator had written extensively online. It was a far right neo-Nazi, and he'd written extensively online about his desire to kill and destroy Muslims. And the conversation was had, or continues to be had, about if he was Muslim and he was expressing these statements about another race, that he probably would have been more extensively watched than what he was. But he didn't raise a flag for whatever reason, and unfortunately, it's the worst massacre in New Zealand's history.
Mm-hmm.
But,
situations like that are certainly challenging. It's part of, I don't know if it was one of the intended benefits when the course was first created, but when you look at breakdowns in the prevention and the protection of public safety, that is a breakdown in kind of maybe on the intelligence gathering side, or even having the right sensors and in place to be able to monitor and realize that those conversations are occurring. But if you think about your day-to-day life, you're in areas all the time where you have zero personal information about the people that are surrounding you, right? You go out to a restaurant, you might not know anyone else. And by having this process of establish a baseline, using these 4 pillars of behavior and define it very specifically, so that you can see those people who stand out in that baseline because of behavior, I don't require any of that personal information about their ability to get any weapons, or what their political or religious beliefs are, or what their kind of where they are in the if they're going through the attack planning cycle. I don't have to worry about those things, because I can focus in based on behavior and not be limited by that. Now, obviously, if there is some sort of ability to further extend those defenses and that security system to be able to monitor all of those platforms, we shouldn't be ignoring them, so that we can just continually reduce the threat and the probability of an attack occurring. But we shouldn't be hamstrung by it either. And just a personal belief and view of this. But I think it would kind of just further improve the public safety that I know a lot of your listeners and a lot of the people that we work with are always striving for.
Absolutely. I think one of the real benefits of works like Left of Bang and there's a couple other books that I recommend quite highly as well, is that it provides otherwise regular people or untrained people or even people that do have some training but maybe it wasn't of a high level, the ability to apply a mental checklist to threats, so they're rationing out their alertness. If we talk about, say, Cooper's color codes, for example, I mean, we don't want to be having everyone hanging around in code red all the time, because they're going to end up incredibly fatigued and they're going to be situationally unaware before long because they're just going to burn through. So the ability, I mean, I used this just last night. I was at a networking event. It was, I was catching a train late at night. I was waiting for a tram connection to a train late at night, and it was an area I wasn't familiar with, and I had a group of youths jump off a tram, and they were heading in my direction. So of course my alertness sort of peaked a little bit just to assess who are they, is there any hostile intent? Because I was standing on my own and I had an iPad in my hand, which wasn't brilliant. wasn't something I usually recommend, but I was doing it. And I was like, okay, let me have a quick look. And I was just able to go through a quick mental checklist and go, no, there's actually no threat here. So I was able to pop back from orange back down to yellow and not burn through any unnecessary adrenaline or spend any unnecessary time thinking about it. So I think being able to have that assurance that you have a system enables you to make that decision so much quicker than if you're constantly arguing with yourself about, what does my gut say? Is this a problem? Is it not a problem? Are they going to suddenly change their behavior and go from being completely passive to reaching out and trying to steal my iPad? Or it just it sort of gives you that benefit of experience in a condensed form.
Yeah, and if you think about it, you personally are exposed to a greater degree of risk every time when you escalate from condition yellow to orange and orange to red. Your situational awareness of the bigger picture goes down because you're now focusing on a specific person, and your ability to take in the bigger picture and see everything that's happening around you goes down the more time you spend looking at a specific person. And so by having the process, you're able to quickly go and say, there's something different about this person, put your attention in, and as you start to work through your cycle, your decision-making process, you realize, nope, they're just running away, or they're just being idiot kids, or whatever that is. They're not posing a risk to me. By having that structure, you can get kind of back out of condition orange more quickly. And, as your attention goes back out to the bigger picture, you're able to start looking for those other things or other people that could be threats as well. So especially in situations where, maybe one person is creating a diversion, so some sort of other crime can occur, the more quickly you can identify someone as a false positive or not having a hostile intent, you start to increase your ability to realize what is going on here, kind of at the larger, broader scale.
Yeah, as you mentioned in the book, I keep saying that because I want people to go and read the book. Okay.
I appreciate that.
This conversation is not a substitute for reading the book. So make sure if anything is of interest in this conversation that you go out and read the book. I'm sure we'll plug it at the end. But you mentioned that people suck at multitasking. And I think that's what you said ties in really nicely there. If you're in condition red or condition orange even, so fixated on one thing, you are missing so much around you. And I think that's the balance, especially when I'm talking to, so I also work in consulting on securing houses of worship. And I'm usually dealing with volunteers who have no training, who are in a security capacity or a safety capacity. And they're potentially looking at groups of hundreds of people. And sometimes they get so fixated on one person who doesn't fit, which is fine. It's good that you're looking at that person, but they're missing what's happening with the other 599 people. And especially with some of the churches that I work with, I mean, they're evangelical, so there will be people that come in that don't look right every single week. In fact, they're actively promoting. They're trying to get people in that are homeless. They're trying to get people in that have drug issues or alcohol issues. They're trying to get people from other faiths and other cultures into the church. So a lot of the barriers that we normally set up from a security point of view don't apply in a house of worship because that's the whole point of the place. So sometimes it's hard to get these people that have all the best intentions but very limited experience to see the broader picture and say, don't just focus on that one guy. Have a look at him, perform an assessment, and then go back to the whole group, because you just don't know. And most of the research that we've done on issues in churches has come from the US, unfortunately, and majority of violence that's happened in churches has been domestic. It's been with someone who is a long-term church member who is bringing a personal issue into the church, as opposed to someone from the outside targeting that church. So yeah, it is a challenge getting people to, you suck at multitasking, so don't fixate on one particular thing.
Yeah, and if you're a solo practitioner, let's say you do executive protection on your own, that's essential to be able to kind of shift into those different levels of awareness. But for any listeners who kind of either work in teams or work in the larger security infrastructure, even just having those processes worked out where if you and I are together and I see you focused in on a person, or you moving into even just have a conversation with a person, I know that your situational awareness has just gone down exponentially. And so that should automatically trigger me to go, okay, if I have their back, if I'm covering for him, I can't watch what he's doing because it's exciting, or I wonder what's going on. I have to be the one now to ensure kind of that greater level of awareness of everything around me, to make sure that you are now not at greater risk by being, maybe both closer to the person you're already engaging and also operating with a decreased level of awareness.
Yeah, I think that team dynamic is so important. Is making sure that oftentimes I'll be dealing with a team that are 3 or 4 people, and they all act as 3 or 4 individuals, and they're not actually maximizing the leverage they have as a team. That they can have someone assigned to an individual and still have someone who's watching the whole crowd, and still have someone who is watching the back of the one who's engaged. And you being able to utilize the extra resources the team gives you is so critically important. And oftentimes we think about it as just a response mechanism. Having more people to respond is better, but having more people to observe is also a huge benefit.
Yes, absolutely.
All right, look, we're coming up on close to time, so let's switch gears and talk a little bit about what you're doing now. We've talked at length about the book. Hopefully, we've convinced a lot of people that are on the fence to go and buy the damn book. But and leave a review. Leave a review.
Yeah.
As someone who struggles for Amazon reviews myself, if you enjoy the book, leave a review. They're gold. The reviews are worth more than the money you pay for the book sometimes.
Sometimes.
Yeah, sometimes. Depends.
Yeah.
It's actually my boss, Dr. Gav Schneider. He wrote a book a couple of years ago, and he had all these positive reviews, and the one negative review was something on the lines of, I can't believe you wrote a book on personal safety and you included 7 pages of references and you didn't reference Rory Miller once, 1 star. Really? Guy wrote a book and you said that his references didn't mention one particular author. That's a special kind of petty.
Yeah. And sometimes those reviews work out great. Like, if that's the most negative thing here, I'm absolutely buying the book. If that's all that people can identify, perfect.
Yeah, I do that as well. And whenever I'm looking at a book, I'll go, okay, let's have a look at what the 5-star reviews say and see whether they sound legitimate or whether they sound like they were written by a bot farm in Manila, or let's see if and then I'll go look at the 1-star reviews and I'll see what people are actually complaining about. And if it's really petty stuff, I'm like, okay, it's probably a good book.
It's probably a pretty good book. I do the same thing.
If the book was terrible, there'd be a lot more reviews.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So what are you doing now? What's life look like for Patrick Van Horne?
Well, so after, as Jason Riley and I wrote the book, we wrote it right as I was transitioning out of the Marines, and we had this goal of expanding the number of people who could learn how to read behavior and recognize threats more quickly. And so my business partner, not Jason, this guy named Jonathan Smith, who's a longtime friend, started a company called the CP Journal, where all of the behaviors that we talk about in Left of Bang, people can learn how to do right through our site. And so we offer a number of different training options, whether you're military or police or security, or applying this in some sort of school or academic setting. So we have courses, we have a practice area. So once you learn how to read behavior, We have a section on our site where you can just go through video after video after video until you build all of those experiences that you need to become comfortable. And so we have that. And then we also run a consulting company where we apply a lot of these behaviors to business settings. So they are not limited to just recognizing threats, but are very applicable when you think about sales and how you're addressing people, customer service, marketing design, overall strategy. And so we spend a good portion of our time also working with clients and companies who are looking to connect with their customers on a more personal level, and not just have a blanket approach, but really be able to learn how to adjust their own behaviors and their own, sometimes even just posture, to the person that they are talking to actually hopefully make some more human connections with them. So anyone who wants to learn more about that, you can find us on our website, which is cp-journal.com, where you can, a lot of things that we talk about here and a lot of things we talk about on the book are all available freely to you through our blog. And then there's a number of other resources and courses that people can look at as well.
Yeah, it is fascinating, isn't it, that you start off trying to learn about violence and attack and threat indicators and so on. And then what you end up doing is really just studying human behavior. And after a while, that evolves and you realize that human behavior is universal across all spectrums. And if you can understand and influence behavior, then the applications are not limited to safety.
Yeah, and we always, when we started working with a lot of private security, we'd find ourselves in a lot of Starbucks where we could sit down with the student and walk them through after they've learned it, walk through the process, observing real people. And you start to identify those spots where comfortable is oftentimes going to attract your attention, especially if your baseline is for people here who are comfortable. And then you take a step back and you go, well, of course people are uncomfortable. They're in certain locations, they're forced to wait for their drink in a really small area and it's crowded and people are bumping into them. They don't have any space. So they're getting naturally uncomfortable because of the conditions and the environment that they're in. And as a security professional, it just creates all of these false positives for you. And when you can take a step back and go, well, why are people uncomfortable, or why are people dominant in these situations? And you realize that sometimes those are legitimate responses. They're not there to hurt anyone. They're just forced into a setting where that's a emotional response. Then you can start to look at, well, how do we remove those triggers? How do we remove those stresses that are causing people to react this way? And when you look at, customer service problems that companies have, you're seeing people who respond with dominance, the same behaviors that we're identifying threats with. That person who is, they didn't get their cup of coffee, two people behind them got their drinks first, and you see them start to shift, from a uncomfortable into a dominant posture. That's the person you're going to have that customer service problem from. And the way that you address them is critical to either de-escalating it or causing something as easy as just pour them their drink and get them out the door into something much larger and a much bigger problem. And so it's been fun, just kind of the evolution of our observation and our application of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that evolution is so critical to stay passionate about what you do as well. I think you've got to continually evolve and continue to push the boundaries. So look, I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with us, Patrick. It's been an honor for me to, this whole show has been an honor for me because I get a chance to talk to people that produce material that has influenced me, and your book is certainly one of those. So thank you again. I'll make sure I put the links in the show notes, and I hope we get a chance to do it again in the future.
Absolutely. I'd be happy to. Thanks so much for having me on. I absolutely appreciate it.
Thank you once again to Mr. Patrick Van Horne for sharing that gold mine of information and a little bit of a story behind the book. And as I said, it is one of the books that I recommend. It's right up there with The Gift of Fear, Can I See Your Hands, On Killing, On Combat, those real upper echelon books on self-defense, violence prevention, and violence management. It's really, really good. So make sure you check that out. Check out Patrick's website, which, as he said, is www.cp-journal.com. And he is available for any sorts of bookings that you may wish to throw at him. And as you heard, quite generous with his time as well. So highly, highly recommended, and super appreciative of Patrick Van Horne for sharing his valuable time with us. All right, that just about does it for this episode. Next week, we have a guest that I have been trying to line up since literally before season 1, episode 3. So it was around about episode 3 of the very first season that I decided that this would be an interview format show predominantly. And one of the top guys that I wanted to get on was one of my instructors and a good friend of mine, Mr. Richard Dimitri. Now, you may know Richard as being the founder of Situational International. He is sometimes known as the Shredder guy because he popularized a concept known as the Shredder, which he possibly regrets because he's been pigeonholed as the eye-gougey, facey, Reiki guy ever since. So we don't talk a lot about the Shredder. I'm sure we can do that later on if there's a need for it. But we have quite a long and in-depth conversation about Richard's journey through martial arts into real violence, real self-defense, and what he's doing now. Richard is a guy I've always felt is about 5 to 10 years ahead of the curve of where everyone else is at. And it's probably not a bad idea to listen to what he's doing now because it is quite different to what most of us in the industry are doing. And I really think that he's found his calling in life. So look, I can't say much more than that. It's a great episode. Make sure you check it out for season 3, episode 10 with Richard Dimitri. It'll be released next week. Until then, I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Managing Violence podcast. For more information or to listen to previous episodes, please check out www.joesaunders.com.au or visit us on YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram. Don't forget to rate and subscribe so you never miss a show.